37 seconds. That's how long Captain Richard Wartenberg, First Officer Lee Truitt, and International Relief Officer Dana Diamond had between calling for takeoff thrust and hearing a sound no pilot ever wants to hear during a takeoff roll. A bell. Not a single chime, but a repeating, insistent alarm that began ringing in the cockpit of UPS Flight 2976 as the McDonnell Douglas MD-11 accelerated down runway 17R at Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport. It was 5:13 p.m. on November 4, 2025. The massive cargo jet was already committed to flight, racing toward 186 knots with a full load of fuel destined for Honolulu. The three experienced pilots had mere seconds to process what was happening, and what they discovered was every aviator's nightmare. Their left engine wasn't just failing, it was gone, completely separated from the wing, lying somewhere back on the runway in the grass, with its entire mounting pylon still attached. And they were already rotating, pulling the nose up, leaving the ground with a crippled aircraft that was about to fall from the sky. 25 seconds. That's all the time they had from the moment that alarm started until the cockpit voice recorder went silent forever. 25 seconds of desperate attempts to control an MD-11 that was rolling hard to the left, with flames erupting from where the engine used to be. The flight data recorder captured their fight against physics itself as the jet climbed to barely 175 feet above the ground, its left wing dipping, the aircraft banking into a death spiral. Dashcam footage and security cameras from businesses near the airport recorded what happened next in horrifying detail. The burning MD-11, its landing gear still extended, its left engine visibly absent, carved a 300-foot gash through the roof of a UPS supply chain warehouse as it began its final descent. Workers inside scrambled as the structure above them was torn open by a falling airplane. But the jet kept moving, kept falling, its trajectory taking it directly toward an industrial area packed with businesses, fuel tanks, and people who had no idea what was about to hit them. The left wing struck next. Kentucky Petroleum Recycling sat directly in the plane's path, its facility holding massive above-ground storage tanks filled with 226,000 gallons of used motor oil and another 37,000 gallons of oil-water antifreeze mixture. When the MD-11's wing slammed into those tanks at over 180 knots, the explosion was catastrophic. Fuel from the aircraft's own tanks, approximately 38,000 gallons of jet fuel, meant for the long Pacific crossing, ignited in a fireball visible for miles. The force of the impact and explosion rolled the aircraft more than 90 degrees to the left. From the ground, witnesses watched in frozen horror as the massive cargo jet, completely inverted, crashed into a semi-truck parking area and then directly into Grade A auto parts. A scrapyard where people were working on an ordinary Monday evening. The impact created a debris field that stretched for half a mile across the industrial zone. Buildings erupted in flames, metal twisted and screamed, and then, for a moment, there was an eerie silence before the screams began. 2 employees from the auto scrapyard were immediately reported as unaccounted for. But as emergency responders descended on the scene, as over 100 firefighters fought to contain the inferno, a terrifying reality emerged. They didn't know how many people had been at Grade A Auto Parts when the plane hit. They didn't know how many customers might have been there. They didn't know who else was in the warehouse that had been torn open, or in the other industrial buildings that had been struck by debris or consumed by fire. Louisville Mayor Craig Greenberg established an emergency reunification center at the Police Training Academy, urging families not to overwhelm hospitals but to come there for information. And they came. 15 families reported relatives who hadn't come home, who weren't answering their phones, who had last been seen going to work in that industrial area near the airport. 15 people whose fates were unknown as darkness fell over Louisville, and smoke continued to billow into the Kentucky sky. The National Transportation Safety Board mobilized immediately. A GO team of 28 investigators was dispatched to Louisville with one mission: figure out what the hell happened. How does an engine simply fall off an aircraft during takeoff? These aren't car parts held on with bolts. Aircraft engines are mounted to wings through pylons designed with redundant attachment points, engineered to withstand forces that would tear apart most structures. They're inspected, maintained, certified. The MD-11 had been in service since the 1990s with a generally solid safety record. This wasn't some aging rust bucket. This was a workhorse of the cargo industry, operated by one of the world's most safety-conscious airlines. Yet investigators found the left engine sitting in the grass beside runway 17R, the entire pylon structure still bolted to it. It hadn't just detached. The whole mounting assembly had failed catastrophically during the takeoff roll. By November 6th, 2 days after the crash, 6 of the missing 15 had been found alive. 6 families received the phone call that their loved ones were okay, that they'd been somewhere else, that there had been confusion in the chaos. But 9 were still missing. 9 families still waited by phones that wouldn't ring with good news. Search and rescue teams worked through the wreckage, through twisted metal that had once been an airplane, through the remains of buildings and vehicles, knowing that each piece of debris they moved might reveal something no one wanted to find. The fire had been nearly contained by 10:30 p.m. on the night of the crash, but the true scope of the disaster was only beginning to emerge. All public schools in Jefferson County closed the next day. UPS temporarily shut down its massive Worldport Air Hub, the company's global shipping nerve center. A shelter-in-place order had initially covered a 5-mile radius around the airport. The Federal Aviation Administration, moving with unusual speed, grounded the entire MD-11 fleet nationwide pending emergency inspections. If you're watching this, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You're going to want to see what investigators found when they listened to that cockpit voice recorder. 4 days after the crash, on November 8th, Mayor Greenberg announced that all the missing were believed to have been located. The final death toll was 14 people. 3 pilots who had done everything humanly possible to save an unsavable aircraft. 11 people on the ground who were simply at work, simply going about their lives in an industrial area that should have been nowhere near an airplane's path. 11 people who died because something went catastrophically wrong with an aircraft they never saw coming. Captain Richard Wartenberg, First Officer Lee Truitt, and Captain Dana Diamond had fought for 25 seconds to prevent exactly that. The cockpit voice recorder captured their struggle. What it revealed would raise questions that shook the aviation industry. Because here's what investigators discovered when they pulled the data. The crew knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what. That bell that started ringing 37 seconds after they called for takeoff thrust. It was already too late. They'd passed V1, the critical decision speed. Past that point, you're committed. You don't have enough runway left to stop a fully loaded MD-11. Your only option is to continue the takeoff and deal with the problem in the air, except they didn't have a problem they could deal with. They had an aircraft that was fundamentally unflyable, missing 1/3 of its thrust, with massive structural damage to the left wing where the pylon had torn away. And they had maybe 8 seconds from rotation to impact to figure out that they were already dead. To understand why this crash was so catastrophic, you need to know what an MD-11 is supposed to be capable of. The McDonnell Douglas MD-11 is a Triget, a 3-engine wide-body aircraft that entered service in 1990. It was designed as an upgrade to the legendary DC-10, stretching the fuselage, adding winglets, modernizing the cockpit with digital flight systems, and improving fuel efficiency. The 3 General Electric CF680C2 engines mounted on this particular aircraft Tail number November 259 Uniform Papa were each capable of producing 61,500 pounds of thrust. These aren't small power plants. Each engine weighs approximately 10,000 pounds and is mounted to the wing through a massive pylon structure designed with multiple redundant attachment points. The engineering is deliberate and overbuilt because the consequences of failure are exactly what happened on November 4th. Here's the thing about trisets that made them popular for cargo operations: redundancy. Lose one engine and you still have two. Federal aviation regulations require that transport category aircraft be capable of continuing takeoff and climbing to a safe altitude even after losing an engine at the worst possible moment, which is called V1, the critical engine failure recognition speed. For the MD-11 on a takeoff like Flight 2976, that speed would have been somewhere around 160 to 170 knots, depending on weight, temperature, and runway conditions. Once you pass V1, you're committed. There isn't enough runway left to stop, so you continue the takeoff, climb out on the remaining engines, and deal with the emergency once you're safely airborne. This is standard procedure. Pilots train for it constantly in simulators. An MD-11 losing one engine at V1 should be survivable. It should be routine, relatively speaking. But Flight 2976 wasn't routine because they didn't just lose an engine. They lost the engine, the pylon, and critically, they lost the structural integrity of their left wing. The timeline investigators reconstructed tells a story of cascading failures happening faster than human reaction time could process. At 5:13 p.m. and approximately 37 seconds, the takeoff thrust was set. The MD-11 began accelerating down runway 17R, which is 887 feet long, more than 2 miles of concrete pointing roughly south. Ground observers had noticed something earlier that afternoon. The aircraft had been delayed 2 hours. Maintenance had been working on the left engine, engine number 1. What exactly they were doing, what they found, what they fixed or didn't fix, those are questions the NTSB would be asking under oath in the coming weeks. But the aircraft was cleared to fly. The crew started their takeoff roll. And then, somewhere around 160 knots, as the aircraft approached rotation speed, something inside engine number 1 failed catastrophically. The NTSB recovered pieces of engine fan blades scattered along runway 17R. They found turbine disc fragments. These are components that spin at thousands of revolutions per minute, contained within the engine casing specifically because if they fail, the energy released is enormous. When turbine blades or disc fragments breach the engine casing, it's called an uncontained engine failure, and it's one of the worst things that can happen. The debris becomes shrapnel, capable of cutting through fuel lines, hydraulic lines, control cables, anything in its path. Video analysis suggests that's exactly what happened. The engine didn't just quit. It came apart violently, and that violence destroyed the pylon attachment points. The entire engine assembly separated from the wing, but not before debris from the disintegrating turbine section did catastrophic damage. Witnesses on the ground watched as flames began erupting from the left wing almost immediately. The fire wasn't coming from where an engine fire normally would be because there was no engine there anymore. The flames were coming from ruptured fuel tanks in the wing itself, from severed fuel lines spraying Jet A into superheated air. And here's where the situation went from critical to impossible. Video footage shows something else. Flames shooting from the tail-mounted center engine, engine number 2. Long streaks of fire that indicate compressor stall, a condition where the normal airflow through the engine is disrupted, causing it to lose thrust and potentially damage itself. Debris from the exploding left engine had been ingested into the center engine's intake. So now, Flight 2976 wasn't flying on 2 good engines. It was struggling to stay airborne on 1. The MD-11 did become airborne. The crew managed to rotate and get the gear off the ground. but the aircraft never climbed higher than 175 feet. Aviation safety expert John Cox, a veteran pilot, told investigators something that should send chills down your spine. That airplane should have flown on 2 engines. He was right. An MD-11 with 2 functioning engines should have been able to climb away, declare an emergency, dump fuel, and return for landing. The fact that it couldn't mean something went fundamentally, horrifically wrong in those 25 seconds between the alarm and the crash. What exactly were the pilots dealing with in that cockpit? What did they see? What did they hear? And most importantly, what could they have possibly done differently? The cockpit voice recorder holds those answers. The cockpit voice recorder from Flight 2976 captured 2 hours and 4 minutes of audio, 2 hours of routine pre-flight checks, crew coordination, normal radio communications with Louisville Tower, and then 25 seconds of something no investigator wants to hear. NTSB board member Todd Inman described it carefully at the media briefing on November 6th. The cockpit voice recorder contained a persistent bell sound. Persistent. That word matters. This wasn't a single chime that could be quickly silenced after identifying the problem. This was a continuous alarm screaming at the crew while they fought to keep their aircraft in the air. In those final moments, the 3 pilots weren't casually running through checklists. They were in a life-or-death struggle with an airplane that was already doomed. What exactly does that bell mean on an MD-11 engine fire warning? When a fire detection loop senses heat or flame in an engine nacelle, that bell starts ringing and it doesn't stop until the fire is extinguished or the aircraft loses electrical power. The crew would have immediately seen the corresponding warning light on their engine fire panel. Engine 1, left engine. The training is clear. Identify, verify, execute. But here's the nightmare they faced. By the time that alarm activated, they were past V1. They couldn't stop. Federal regulations and aircraft performance data dictate that once you pass that critical speed, attempting to abort the takeoff will send you off the end of the runway. You must continue. You must fly, even if one of your engines is on fire, even if that fire warning bell is telling you something is catastrophically wrong. The flight data recorder filled in the gaps the voice recorder couldn't. Second by second, it logged every parameter. Airspeed, altitude, engine thrust settings, control surface positions, dozens of sensors feeding data to the recorder's solid-state memory. That data showed something that initially confused investigators. The aircraft did achieve rotation speed. The pilots did pull back on the controls. The nose did come up. But the climb rate was anemic. A fully loaded MD-11 on 3 engines should be able to climb at over 2 zozern feet per minute after takeoff. Flight 2976 barely managed 100 feet above the ground before it started descending. The last NTSB transmission, at 5:13 and 32 seconds, showed 183 knots ground speed and 475 feet above sea level, which is only about 100 feet above the terrain at that location. Then, nothing. The transponder went silent. The aircraft was gone. Comment below what you think could have prevented this tragedy. I want to hear your thoughts. Video evidence corroborated what the data was showing. Multiple angles captured by security cameras, dash cams, even cell phones from people who heard the engines and looked up. Every piece of footage showed the same terrifying reality. Flames erupting not just from where the left engine should have been, but from the tail. Long, bright flames shooting rearward from the center engine, the number 2 engine mounted in the tail cone. Aviation experts who analyzed the video immediately recognized it. Compressor stall. It happens when the smooth airflow through a jet engine is disrupted, causing the engine to lose thrust and sometimes damage itself internally. But what causes compressor stall during takeoff? Foreign object ingestion. Something went into that engine that shouldn't have been there, and investigators knew exactly what that something was. Pieces of engine number 1. When a turbofan engine catastrophically fails, when turbine blades spinning at thousands of RPM break loose and punch through the engine casing, The debris doesn't just fall harmlessly to the ground. It becomes shrapnel traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. Some of it hits the ground, which is why investigators found fan blades and turbine fragments scattered along runway 17R. But some of it goes airborne, caught in the airstream around the aircraft. And on an MD-11, the geometry is particularly dangerous. The center engine sits in the tail, directly behind the left wing. Its intake is positioned perfectly to ingest anything coming off the left engine. That's apparently what happened. The exploding left engine didn't just separate from the wing. It sent debris directly into the number 2 engine, causing it to stall and lose thrust at the worst possible moment. So Flight 2976 wasn't flying on 2 good engines. It was struggling to stay airborne on one engine, the right engine, while simultaneously dealing with massive structural damage to the left wing, fuel leaking and burning, and control problems from asymmetric thrust. The pilots had maybe 8 seconds from liftoff to impact to process all of this and attempt corrective action. 8 seconds to realize they were flying a dying aircraft. 8 seconds to try moves that textbooks say should work, but physics says won't. 8 seconds before their cockpit voice recorder stopped recording forever. The question everyone was asking, how did this happen? The investigation into Flight 2976 quickly zeroed in on one critical question. Why did that engine separate? NTSB investigators meticulously documented the left engine where it lay in the grass, 200 feet down, runway 17R from the departure threshold. The entire pylon structure was still attached, which told them something crucial. This wasn't a case of mounting bolts failing one by one. The whole assembly had torn away from the wing in a single catastrophic event. But pylons don't just rip off. They're designed with multiple redundant attachment points specifically to prevent exactly this scenario. So what was different about November 259? Uniform Papa? The answer started emerging when investigators pulled the maintenance records. The aircraft had been delayed that afternoon. 2 hours. Maintenance crews had been working on engine number 1, but that wasn't the only recent work on that engine. 3 days earlier, on November 1st, the MD-11 had been in San Antonio undergoing scheduled heavy maintenance at a contracted repair facility. Part of that maintenance involved work on the left engine and its pylon. When NTSB metallurgists examined the pylon attachment points under microscopes and X-ray imaging, they found something that made their blood run cold: improper torque specifications on critical mounting hardware. Some bolts that should have been torqued to 450 foot-pounds showed evidence of being significantly under-torqued. Others showed signs of over-torque that had begun microfracturing the metal. But it gets worse. The investigation revealed that during the engine's uncontained failure, when turbine blades broke loose and punctured through the casing, the violent vibrations and forces were transmitted directly to those already compromised mounting points. A properly maintained pylon might have survived, might have held the damaged engine to the wing long enough for the pilots to safely abort the takeoff, or at least get airborne and attempt an emergency landing. Instead, the combination of explosive engine failure and improper maintenance created a perfect storm. The mounting hardware failed almost simultaneously. The entire engine, all 10,000 pounds of it, plus the pylon structure, separated from the wing while the aircraft was still on the runway doing 160 knots. Here's where the timeline becomes absolutely critical. The persistent bell that the cockpit voice recorder captured. It started 37 seconds after takeoff thrust was applied. Investigators calculated that the actual engine separation happened slightly earlier, probably around 30 to 33 seconds into the roll. But there's a delay between when an event occurs and when the warning systems detect it and alert the crew. So by the time that bell started ringing in the cockpit, Flight 2976 had already passed V1. The crew had already committed to flight. They didn't know their left engine was gone. They knew they had a fire warning. They knew something was catastrophically wrong. But in the few seconds they had to process the situation, they couldn't have known the full extent of the damage. They couldn't have known that debris from the exploding engine was about to take out their center engine. They couldn't have known they were trying to fly an aircraft that had already become unflyable. The NTSB brought in Boeing engineers and McDonnell Douglas legacy experts to run simulations. They fed the exact parameters from Flight 2976 into flight simulators. Weight, speed, configuration, single-engine operation with structural damage. The results were sobering. Even the most experienced test pilots couldn't keep the simulated aircraft in the air for more than a few seconds longer than the actual crew managed. Captain Wartenberg, First Officer Truitt, and IRO Diamond did everything right. They followed their training. They attempted the impossible, but physics doesn't care about training or experience or courage. An MD-11 that heavy, that fast, with that much damage, cannot fly on one engine at 100 feet above the ground. The investigation also uncovered something that sent shockwaves through the cargo aviation industry. This wasn't the first time this particular MD-11 had experienced engine issues. Maintenance logs showed a pattern of recurring problems with engine number 1 over the previous 6 months. Vibration alerts, oil pressure anomalies. Nothing major enough to ground the aircraft, but a pattern nonetheless. And here's the revelation that changed everything. The facility in San Antonio that had performed the heavy maintenance 3 days before the crash was under FAA investigation for potentially falsifying inspection records on other aircraft. Suddenly, this wasn't just an accident. This was potentially criminal negligence. What went wrong in San Antonio? What shortcuts were taken? And why didn't anyone catch it before Flight 2976 pushed back from the gate? The National Transportation Safety Board's preliminary findings painted a devastating picture of systemic failures. The San Antonio maintenance facility that had worked on November 259 Uniform Papa 3 days before the crash was already under FAA scrutiny. Investigators discovered that critical engine pylon attachment hardware had been improperly installed during that heavy maintenance check. Bolts that secure an engine weighing 10,000 pounds to an aircraft wing had been torqued incorrectly, some too tight, causing stress fractures in the metal, others too loose, allowing microscopic movement that would eventually lead to catastrophic failure. It was a ticking time bomb, and Flight 2976 was the aircraft that ran out of time. But the investigation revealed something even more troubling: the recurring issues with engine number 1 over the previous 6 months, the vibration alerts, the oil pressure anomalies. They weren't isolated incidents. They were warnings, red flags that something fundamental was wrong with that engine or its mounting system. Yet the aircraft continued flying, continued carrying cargo across the Pacific, continued operating until that Monday evening in November, when all those warning signs converged into 25 seconds of horror that ended 14 lives. The Federal Aviation Administration moved swiftly in the aftermath. On November 8th, 4 days after the crash, the agency issued an emergency airworthiness directive grounding the entire global MD-11 fleet. 59 aircraft were immediately pulled from service. FedEx lost 29 freighters overnight. UPS lost 25. Western Global lost 5. The impact on cargo operations was massive, but the FAA made clear that no MD-11 would fly again until every single engine pylon was inspected using methods approved by federal authorities. Boeing, which had acquired McDonnell Douglas in 1997, recommended that all 3 operators suspend operations indefinitely while additional engineering analysis was performed. The phrase "abundance of caution" was used, but everyone knew what it really meant. They had no idea how widespread the problem might be. On November 14th, the NTSB released new information about the missing. Those 9 people who had remained unaccounted for days after the crash had all been located. Some had been at work in the industrial buildings that were destroyed. Others had been customers at Grade A auto parts, there to sell scrap metal or buy used auto parts, who happened to be in exactly the wrong place when 200 tons of burning aircraft fell from the sky. Their names were released to the public. Real people with families, with lives, with futures that ended because maintenance workers in San Antonio either didn't know or didn't care about proper torque specifications on engine mounting hardware. Captain Richard Wartenberg had over 15 Zero flight hours. First Officer Lee Truitt had been with UPS for 12 years. International Relief Officer Dana Diamond was a former military pilot. 3 professionals who did everything right and died anyway because the aircraft they were trusted to fly had been compromised before they ever walked onto the flight deck. The 11 people on the ground never had a chance. They didn't choose to be part of this tragedy. It chose them. Share this video with someone who needs to understand why aviation safety regulations exist, why proper maintenance isn't optional, why cutting corners kills people. The final NTSB report won't be complete for at least a year. There will be hearings, testimony, forensic analysis of every bolt and rivet recovered from the wreckage. There will be lawsuits, settlements, possibly criminal charges if negligence is proven. The MD-11 fleet will eventually return to service, but only after inspections that should have been done correctly the first time. And 14 families will live with a loss that should never have happened. Flight 2976 didn't crash because of weather or pilot error or an unavoidable mechanical failure. It crashed because people failed to do their jobs correctly, because a system that should have caught those failures didn't, because an aircraft with a documented history of engine problems was cleared to fly one more time. 37 seconds, 25 seconds. That's all it took for everything to go wrong. But the real tragedy is that it was all preventable.